On the 28th of October 1993, a woman once known across the entire country by a single nickname, the richest girl in the world, died inside her own Beverly Hills mansion at the age of 80, following months of declining health that had already drawn her household staff and a rotating team of private medical caregivers into an increasingly closed, private world around her. News of her death reached the public within hours, obituaries across the country, reflecting back on a life spent almost entirely in the public imagination as a symbol of nearly unimaginable inherited wealth, even as the woman herself had spent decades trying to live at a careful distance from that exact image. When her final will was read, it produced a detail strange enough to make headlines on its own, overshadowing even the considerable coverage of her death itself. The man named as executor of her estate, the man handed formal authority over a fortune that would eventually be valued at well over $1 billion, was not a relative, not a longtime financial advisor, not any of the attorneys or bankers who had managed her affairs for decades. It was her butler, a man who had entered her household staff only a handful of years earlier, whose formal education ended in his teens, whose prior professional experience ran through flight attending and household service rather than anything resembling finance or estate law, now held the keys to one of the largest private fortunes in America. If you have followed this series from the beginning, you already know the usual failure modes by heart. A fortune fragmented among too many careless heirs, a will left unwritten or written without witnesses, or contested by family members convinced they knew better. This is a different kind of failure entirely, and in some ways a more unsettling one, because it did not come from carelessness or absence. It came from a woman who spent almost her entire adult life building walls specifically to protect her independence from exactly this kind of outside influence, and who in the last years of that same guarded life ended up with almost nobody left inside those walls except the one person now holding all the keys. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the fortune itself, because nobody handed Doris Duke an ordinary inheritance. Her father built one of the great industrial empires of the Gilded Age, consolidating the American tobacco industry into a single dominant company through a relentless campaign of acquisitions and aggressive competition that crushed or absorbed nearly every serious regional rival across barely a decade, and later expanding aggressively into hydroelectric power, building the utility company that still bears the family name today, damming rivers across the Carolinas to electrify an entire region that had previously depended almost entirely on scattered, inefficient local power. He was, by every account, a man who understood control intimately, ruthless in business, exacting in his personal life, and singularly focused on making sure the fortune he built stayed firmly under family control rather than dissolving the way so many industrial dynasties before his had already begun to. He gave enormous sums to establish and endow a university that would eventually carry the family name, an act of philanthropy on a scale that made him, for a period, one of the most significant individual benefactors in the entire history of American higher education, even as he remained, in his business dealings, one of the most feared and litigious operators of his entire era. When he died in 1925, his only child inherited the overwhelming majority of that fortune at the age of 12, an inheritance so large relative to the country's own economy at the time that newspapers immediately and permanently branded her the richest girl in the world, a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life, whether she wanted it or not. Overnight, a 12-year-old child became one of the wealthiest individuals in the United States, and from that moment forward, virtually every person who ever approached her, every suitor, every acquaintance, every distant relative who suddenly remembered the family connection, arrived trailing at least some degree of suspicion about what they actually wanted from her. That suspicion, understandable as it was, hardened over the following decades into something closer to a permanent operating principle. She grew into an adult famous not just for her fortune, but for her fierce, sometimes combative insistence on controlling every part of her own life personally, resisting the small army of advisors, suitors, and hangers-on who spent decades trying to attach themselves to her money. She married twice, both marriages ending in divorce, both settlements negotiated on her own terms rather than anyone else's, and she made clear throughout both relationships and their eventual dissolutions that she alone would decide the terms on which anyone was allowed access to her considerable resources. She pursued her own interests with the same independence, restoring historic properties on both coasts and in the Pacific, collecting art and Islamic architecture with a scholar's seriousness, rather than any casual society hobbyist's interest, funding archaeological and wildlife causes largely according to her own personal judgment rather than any advisor's recommendation, flying her own restored aircraft at a time when few women of any background did so, let alone women of her particular fame and fortune. She was, by nearly every account of those who knew her across her adult life, someone who trusted her own instincts about her own fortune more than she trusted almost anyone else's advice, a woman who had watched people angle for her money since she was 12 years old and built her entire adult personality, at least in part, as a defense against exactly that. This is the detail worth sitting with because it is the hinge this entire episode turns on. The same fierce independence that protected Doris Duke from decades of fortune hunters did nothing to protect her from the one form of risk independence itself quietly creates. A person surrounded by nobody they trust is vulnerable in one direction. A person who has spent decades deliberately narrowing the circle of people they trust down to almost nobody is vulnerable in a different, quieter direction, because eventually whoever remains inside that narrow circle, however they got there, ends up holding influence entirely disproportionate to how many other people are left to check them. By the final years of her life, that narrowing circle had a name. She had hired a personal aide, originally brought on in a modest household service capacity, who over the following years steadily became something closer to her constant companion and closest personal confidant, present for her daily routines, her medical appointments, her travel, in a way none of her more formal advisors, attorneys, or distant family members any longer were. His formal background offered little obvious preparation for the role he was steadily accumulating. He had worked in service industries, including a period as a flight attendant, before entering her household staff, and he held no financial, legal, or fiduciary training of any kind. Colleagues and household staff, who observed the relationship over its final years, would later describe a dynamic in which he grew increasingly indispensable to her daily comfort and routine, even as his authority over decisions, well beyond any traditional household role, expanded alongside it. A gradual, almost imperceptible shift that nobody around them at the time seems to have fully registered as unusual, until it was already largely complete. What he did have, increasingly across her final years, was proximity. The simple, powerful advantage of being the person physically present in the room every single day, while almost everyone else who had once surrounded her fortune was not. A form of leverage this series has now seen operate in one form or another across multiple estates, though rarely this starkly concentrated in a single household relationship. In her final months, her health declining and her public appearances growing rarer, that proximity translated directly into formal authority. A new will, executed shortly before her death, named this same aide as executor of her entire estate and as a trustee, alongside a modest additional group, of the charitable foundation meant to carry her philanthropic legacy forward, a foundation whose assets would eventually be valued at well over $1 billion. The document also provided him a personal bequest and, critically, a substantial annual fee tied directly to his role administering the estate, a financial arrangement that meant the man now controlling her fortune also stood to personally benefit, year after year, from continuing to control it. The reaction, once the will became public, was immediate and fierce. Family members, former household staff, and longtime financial advisors who had spent decades around her fortune without ever accumulating anything close to this level of formal authority challenged the will almost at once. Raising the same category of argument this series has now seen surface again and again whenever an estate's final documents surprised the people who expected to be closer to its center. They argued undue influence, the claim that her closest aide had used his uniquely privileged, unsupervised access during her final, declining years to steer decisions in his own favor at a moment when she was least equipped to resist that steering. They pointed to her declining health, to reports of heavy medication in her final period, to the sheer speed with which his formal authority had expanded relative to how recently he had entered her life at all, especially set against family relationships and advisory relationships that had, in some cases, existed for decades before he ever arrived. Some of the challenges specifically questioned whether she had possessed the necessary mental clarity at the moment the final will was actually executed, a question this series has now watched surface in nearly identical form in earlier disputes, each time proving nearly impossible to resolve with total certainty once the person whose intentions are actually in question is no longer able to speak for themselves. There was a further darker layer to the dispute as well. In the years that followed her death, A private nurse who had cared for her in her final days came forward with disturbing allegations about the circumstances surrounding the final hours themselves, allegations serious enough to draw law enforcement attention and to become their own significant part of the broader controversy, even though no criminal charges were ultimately proven in connection with them. The nurse's account, aired publicly through a subsequent lawsuit of her own, described a household in her employer's final days that felt, by her telling, unusually closed off from independent medical oversight. Decisions about care and medication concentrated among a very small number of people, rather than any broader team of physicians acting with full independence. Whatever the truth of those specific claims, their mere existence deepened the surrounding sense that the small circle of people closest to Doris Duke in her final period had accumulated a kind of unchecked authority nobody, including perhaps Doris Duke herself, in her healthier years, would ever have knowingly designed. The dispute moved through New York's Surrogates Court, the same specialized venue this series has now seen handle multiple estates of this scale, and rather than proceeding to a lengthy public trial, the parties eventually reached a negotiated settlement roughly 3 years after her death. Under its terms, sole authority was stripped away from the single aide and replaced with a more conventional, institutionally supervised arrangement. An established banking institution brought on as co-executor alongside him, his personal compensation curtailed substantially from what the original will had specified, and a broader, more formally credentialed board ultimately installed to oversee the charitable foundation going forward. Its membership drawn from figures with genuine backgrounds in philanthropy, finance, and the specific causes the foundation was meant to serve, rather than any single household relationship. It was, in its own way, this series' familiar corrective mechanism finally arriving, professional, institutional oversight replacing a single individual's concentrated, unsupervised authority, the same basic fix that rescued Graceland a generation earlier and protected countless other fortunes this series has examined. It simply arrived here after the fact, imposed by a court following years of contentious litigation, rather than built in advance by the founder herself while she was still healthy enough to design it deliberately. The aide who had so briefly held such outsized authority did not live to see the dispute fully resolved. He died in 1996, a few years after her, his own health undermined by years of serious alcohol dependence that had reportedly worsened considerably during his time managing her affairs, the pressure and scrutiny of his sudden controversial prominence apparently taking its own toll on him in the years between her death and his. By the time the settlement was fully implemented, the fortune he had briefly controversially controlled was already well on its way into the hands of the institutional structure that exists to this day. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation now operates as one of the significant philanthropic institutions in the country, funding medical research, environmental conservation, and the arts largely along the lines she had spent her own lifetime caring about, governed today by a proper, credentialed board rather than any single household employee. So what does this episode actually teach that the others in this series have not? Every prior founder who failed did so through some form of absence, no will, an ambiguous will, a management structure nobody built. Doris Duke built something. She built independence, fiercely, deliberately, across an entire adult lifetime spent resisting exactly the kind of outside influence over her fortune this series has repeatedly shown destroy other families. And it was that very success at building independence that quietly, gradually produced the opposite of what she intended. A fortress with no other trusted people left inside it does not stay empty. Eventually, whoever remains inside becomes by simple default the only checkpoint left standing between an aging founder's final decisions and the rest of the world, whether or not that person was ever the right one to hold that position, and whether or not the founder herself, in her healthier and more clear-eyed years, would ever have knowingly chosen to concentrate that much unchecked authority in one single, relatively new pair of hands. Compare that to the structures this series has praised in earlier episodes. A formal, multi-trustee arrangement like the one the DuPonts built to hold a company's shares together for 60 years, or the professionally staffed, institutionally governed board eventually installed to run Doris Duke's own foundation after her death. The common thread running through every fortune in this series that actually survived intact is not the absence of trusted individuals. It is the presence of more than one, arranged so that no single relationship, however close, however sincere, however earned, is ever the last and only check standing between a fortune and whoever happens to be standing closest to it in a founder's final, most vulnerable days. So think back to that will, read aloud in the days after her death, naming a household aide who had entered her life only a handful of years earlier as the man now controlling a fortune built across 3 generations of one of America's great industrial families. Doris Duke spent almost her entire adult life building walls to keep exactly this kind of concentrated, unsupervised influence away from her own money, resisting suitors, distant relatives, financial advisors, and anyone else who ever seemed more interested in her fortune than in her. In the very last years of that guarded life, the walls she had built so carefully around herself left only one person standing close enough to matter, and by the time anyone else noticed, he was already holding the keys to nearly everything she had spent a lifetime trying to protect. There is a version of this story that ends there, a cautionary tale about one unlikely household relationship and one surprising will. But the sharper version, the one this series keeps circling back to from a dozen different angles now, is about what independence itself can quietly cost a person if it is never balanced against anything else. Every other founder in this series failed by trusting too little structure or building none at all. Doris Duke failed, if that is even the right word for a woman who still died one of the wealthiest people in the country, by trusting too completely in her own solitary judgment for so long that when her judgment finally began to fail her in her final years, there was no second opinion left in the room to notice. The foundation that bears her name today operates exactly as she once hoped it would, funding the causes she cared about, governed by the kind of institutional oversight she never quite built for herself while she still could. It simply took a courtroom, a settlement, and one household employee's early death to finally get there.